The dust kicked up by Jake Morrison's horse settled slowly in the hot afternoon sun as he rode into Copper Ridge. People on the wooden sidewalks stopped what they were doing to watch him pass. Some quickly looked away. Others stared with a mix of fear and curiosity. Everyone knew who he was. Jake Morrison wasn't just any gunfighter. He was the man they called Deadeye, a name that had traveled across 3 territories. His black hat was pulled low over his eyes, and his long coat hid the twin revolvers that had made him famous. Or maybe infamous was a better word. He hadn't come to Copper Ridge looking for trouble, at least not the kind that involved bullets flying. He was here to collect money that cattle baron William Hayes owed him from a job done months ago. Hayes had been avoiding him, but Jake's patience had run out. As he guided his horse down the main street, Jake heard shouting coming from the town square. A crowd had gathered around a wooden platform that had been set up in front of the general store. At first he thought it might be some kind of celebration or political speech, but as he got closer, the sick feeling in his stomach told him it was something much worse. "What do I hear for this strong young man?" a loud voice called out. "He can work your fields, fix your fences, whatever you need." "Do I hear $20? Jake pulled his horse to a stop at the edge of the crowd. His jaw tightened as he realized what he was seeing. It was a human auction. People were selling themselves and their family members into what they called indentured servitude, but everyone knew it was just slavery with fancy words. The drought had been hard on everyone. Crops had failed, cattle had died, and banks were taking people's land. Some families had gotten so desperate that they sold themselves to whoever would pay, hoping to work off their debt someday. Jake had heard about these auctions happening in other towns, but this was the first time he'd seen one with his own eyes. On the platform stood a man in his 30s, his head hanging low in shame. His wife and 2 small children stood nearby, crying quietly. The auctioneer was a fat man in a fancy suit who looked like he was enjoying himself way too much. $25, someone in the crowd called out. $30, shouted another voice. Jake watched with disgust as human beings were bought and sold like cattle. He was about to turn away when he saw her. At the side of the platform, waiting her turn, stood a woman unlike anyone he'd ever seen. She was Apache. That much was clear from her features and the simple buckskin dress she wore. But it wasn't her appearance that caught his attention. It was the way she stood. While everyone else on that platform looked broken and defeated, she stood straight and tall. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her dark eyes held something Jake recognized, a fire that refused to be put out, no matter how much pain had tried to smother it. "Next up," the auctioneer announced as the man and his family were led away by their new owner, "we have a special item. This here Apache woman is young, strong, and house-trained. She can cook, clean, and do whatever other work you might need," the crowd murmured as the woman stepped forward. Jake noticed how some of the men in the crowd looked at her, and his hands unconsciously moved closer to his guns. "Now, I'll warn you," the auctioneer continued. "She don't speak much English, but she understands it well enough. And she's been broken and proper, if you know what I mean. Her husband got himself killed in a cavalry raid a few months back, so she's got no family to cause trouble." The woman's face remained stone still, but Jake saw her hands clench into fists at her sides. He found himself studying her more closely. There were faded bruises on her arms and what looked like rope burns around her wrists. Someone had hurt her, and recently. "Let's start the bidding at $15, the auctioneer called out. "15, came a voice from the crowd. "20, shouted another. Jake watched as the price climbed higher. He told himself to ride away. This wasn't his problem. He had his own business to take care of, and getting involved in something like this would only complicate things. But something about the woman held his attention. Maybe it was the way she refused to look down at the ground like the others had. Maybe it was how she seemed to be memorizing every face in the crowd, like she was planning something. Or maybe it was just that he recognized something in her eyes, the same emptiness he saw when he looked in the mirror. $35, someone yelled. It was Tom Bradley, a rancher Jake knew had a reputation for being rough with his workers. 40, came another bid. The woman's eyes moved across the crowd and suddenly locked onto Jake's. For a moment it felt like everyone else disappeared. In that look he saw pain, anger, and something else, a plea she was too proud to speak out loud. Without really thinking about it, Jake heard his own voice call out, $50. The crowd turned to look at him, and several people stepped back when they recognized who had made the bid. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with dollar signs. $50 from the gentleman in black. Do I hear 55? Jake saw Tom Bradley look at him and then shake his head, clearly not wanting to get into a bidding war with someone like Deadeye Morrison. 50 going once, the auctioneer called out. Jake could feel the woman's eyes still on him, but he couldn't read the expression on her face. 50 going twice. Part of Jake's mind was screaming at him to shut his mouth and ride away. He didn't need complications in his life. He didn't need responsibilities. And he definitely didn't need to be taking care of some Apache woman who would probably try to kill him in his sleep. Sold to the gentleman in black for $50, but it was too late. The deed was done. Jake had just bought himself a person, something he'd sworn he would never do. As he dismounted his horse and walked toward the platform to pay, he wondered what the hell he'd just gotten himself into. The woman watched him approach, her dark eyes never leaving his face. There was no gratitude in her expression, no relief. If anything, she looked like she was studying him, trying to figure out what kind of man had just bought her life. Jake paid the auctioneer and found himself standing face to face with the woman. Up close, he could see more scars, a thin line across her left cheek, old burn marks on her hands. Someone had put her through hell and somehow she'd survived it. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She looked at him for a long moment before answering in accented but clear English. "Ayanna." It was the first time she'd spoken during the entire auction, and Jake realized the auctioneer had been wrong about her English. She understood it perfectly. She'd just chosen not to speak. "Well, Ayanna," Jake said, "I guess you're coming with me." She nodded once, a small, sharp movement of her head. Then she stepped down from the platform and followed him to his horse, her back straight and her head high, like a queen walking to her throne instead of a woman walking into slavery. As they left Copper Ridge behind them, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't even imagine yet. The ride to Jake's ranch took almost 2 hours, and not a single word passed between them. Ayanna walked beside his horse with steady steps, never asking to rest, never complaining about the heat or the rocky ground that must have been hurting her feet through her worn moccasins. Jake found himself glancing down at her more often than he wanted to admit. She moved like someone who was used to traveling long distances on foot. Her eyes constantly scanned the landscape around them, taking in every detail. The way the wind moved through the grass, the direction of the sun, the distant mountains that marked the horizon. She was mapping everything, Jake realized, learning the lay of the land in case she needed to run. The thought bothered him more than it should have. "You planning on taking off the first chance you get?" he asked when they were about halfway to his place. Ayanna looked up at him, her dark eyes unreadable. "Where would I go?" she replied simply. It was a good question and one that made Jake's chest tighten with an emotion he didn't want to name. Her people were scattered or dead. The cavalry had made sure of that. She had no family, no home, no place where she belonged. In a way, she was just as lost as he was. When they finally reached his ranch, Jake could see it through her eyes, and it wasn't much to look at. The house was small and plain, built more for function than comfort. The barn needed repairs, and the fences around the corral were patched in several places. It was the home of a man who lived alone and didn't expect visitors. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the post near the front porch. "This is it," he said, gesturing toward the modest buildings. "Not much, but it's dry and it's got 4 walls. Ayanna stood in the yard, turning slowly to take in everything around her. Jake watched her examine the water pump, the vegetable garden that was struggling in the heat, the chicken coop where a few scrawny birds pecked at the dirt. "The old woman who used to keep house for me lived in that cabin," Jake said, pointing to a small building about 50 yards from the main house. "She died last winter. It's got a bed, a stove, and a place to wash up. You can stay there." Ayanna walked over to the cabin and peered through the single window. Jake followed her, suddenly feeling awkward about the whole situation. He'd never owned another person before, and he wasn't sure how it was supposed to work. "Look," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I don't really know how to do this. I'm not good with people. I bought you because, hell, I don't even know why I bought you. But you're here now, so we might as well figure out how to make it work." She turned to face him, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw something that might have been amusement in her eyes. "You need someone to cook your food and wash your clothes. she said matter-of-factly. "I need a place to sleep and food to eat." "It's not complicated." Jake nodded, though something about her tone made him feel like there was more to it than that. "The kitchen's in the main house. There's flour, beans, some salt pork. Help yourself to whatever you need." "I'm not picky about food. When do you eat?" she asked. "Whenever I'm hungry, I guess. I'm not much for schedules." Ayanna looked at him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "You live alone out here?" "For 3 years now." "No wife? No children?" "No." The word came out sharper than Jake intended. "No family at all." Something shifted in her expression. Not sympathy exactly, but understanding. Like she recognized the particular kind of loneliness that came with being the only one left. "I'll make dinner when the sun gets lower," she said. "You have plates?" Jake almost smiled. "Yeah, I've got plates. Cups too, and forks if you're feeling fancy." That evening, Jake sat at his kitchen table and watched Ayanna move around his space with quiet efficiency. She'd found everything she needed without asking. The coffee pot, the skillet, the jar of flour he kept on the shelf. She cooked like someone who was used to making meals out of whatever was available. The beans and cornbread she prepared were simple, but better than anything Jake had eaten in months. He wanted to tell her so, but something about the careful distance she maintained made him keep the words to himself. After dinner, she cleaned the dishes without being asked and then headed toward the door. "Ayanna," Jake called after her. She stopped and turned back. "The door to the cabin, it doesn't have a lock?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you telling me I should be afraid?" The question hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He realized how it must look to her. A strange man bringing her to an isolated place where no one could hear her scream. Where no one would help her if she needed it. "No," he said quietly. "You don't need to be afraid. Not of me." She studied his face in the lamplight, seeming to weigh his words against whatever experience had taught her about trusting men. "Good," she said finally, "because I don't scare easy anymore." There was something in the way she said it that made Jake believe her completely. After she left, Jake sat alone at his table, listening to the sounds drifting from the cabin, footsteps, the creak of the bed, the soft sound of water being poured into a basin, normal sounds of someone settling in for the night. It had been 3 years since there had been another person on his land. 3 years since he'd heard anyone moving around in the evening, going about the small rituals of daily life. He'd forgotten how those sounds could make a place feel less empty. Later, as he was getting ready for bed himself, Jake heard something that made him stop and listen. It was singing, a low, haunting melody unlike anything he'd ever heard before. The words were in Apache, so he couldn't understand them, but he didn't need to. The song carried grief in every note, a sadness so deep it seemed to echo across the desert and bounce off the mountains. Jake stood at his bedroom window, looking out toward the cabin where a single candle flickered behind the curtain. He listened to Ayanna's song and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the recognition that someone else in the world carried pain as heavy as his own. The singing went on for a long time, sometimes rising and falling like a conversation with ghosts. When it finally stopped, Jake found that his own eyes were wet, though he couldn't say exactly why. He lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the hell he'd gotten himself into. Having another person around was going to change things, whether he wanted it to or not. The question was whether it would change them for better or worse. Outside his window, the desert was quiet except for the wind and the distant call of a coyote. But for the first time in 3 years, Jake Morrison didn't feel completely alone in the world. The next few days fell into a careful rhythm. Ayanna would appear at the main house before sunrise to start coffee and breakfast. Jake would eat in silence while she moved around the kitchen, cleaning up from the night before and preparing for the day ahead. After breakfast, she would disappear for hours at a time, exploring the ranch or tending to tasks he never asked her to do. Jake started noticing small changes around his place. The vegetables in his struggling garden were suddenly standing straighter, the weeds pulled and the soil loosened around their roots. His clothes appeared clean and mended on his bed. The chicken coop got fixed without him saying a word about it. But it was the little details about Ayanna herself that Jake found himself paying attention to, even when he tried not to. The way she always kept her back to the wall when she was in a room. How she would freeze for just a moment when he came up behind her too quickly. The careful way she moved her left arm, like something there still hurt. It was on the fourth day that Jake really started to see the scars. He'd been working on repairing a section of fence when one of his horses got spooked by a rattlesnake and took off toward the barn. Jake dropped his tools and ran after the animal, worried it might hurt itself or damage something in its panic. When he rounded the corner of the barn, he found Ayanna already there, standing perfectly still with her hand extended toward the frightened horse. She was making soft sounds in Apache, words that seemed to calm the animal almost immediately. "Easy, boy," she murmured in English, stepping closer. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The horse let her approach and even allowed her to take hold of its halter. As she turned to lead it back toward the corral, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. The sleeves of her dress had been pushed up while she worked in the garden earlier, and now he could see her forearms clearly. Around both wrists were rings of scarred tissue, the kind of marks left by ropes or chains. They were old scars, white and smooth, but deep enough that they would never completely fade. Ayanna noticed him staring and quickly pulled her sleeves down, but it was too late. Jake had seen enough to understand some of what she'd been through. "You're good with horses," he said, trying to keep his voice normal. "Animals don't lie," she replied simply. "They don't pretend to be something they're not." That evening, a sudden thunderstorm rolled across the desert. Jake was sitting at his kitchen table going through some old bills by lamplight when the first crack of thunder shook the house. The storm came fast and violent, the way they often did in that part of the country. When lightning lit up the sky, Jake saw something that made him abandon his paperwork and head for the door. Ayanna was running across the yard toward the barn, not seeking shelter but moving like someone being chased by demons. He found her in one of the empty horse stalls, curled up in the corner with her arms wrapped around her knees. She was shaking, not from cold but from something much deeper. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, like she was seeing something that wasn't there. "Ayanna?" Jake said softly, not wanting to startle her. She didn't seem to hear him. Her lips were moving, whispering words in Apache that sounded like prayers or pleas. Another crack of thunder made her flinch and press herself harder against the wall. Jake realized she wasn't really in the barn with him at all. She was somewhere else, sometime else, reliving whatever had put those scars on her wrists. Jake had seen men like this before, soldiers who'd been through too much, cowboys who'd survived Indian raids or bandit attacks. He'd felt it himself sometimes when certain sounds or smells would take him back to the day his family died. "Hey," he said, moving slowly into the stall and crouching down a few feet away from her. "You're safe. It's just a storm." Her eyes finally focused on his face, but it took a long moment for recognition to return. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to—" "Nothing to be sorry for," Jake said. "Thunder can be loud when you're not expecting it." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain pound on the barn roof. Gradually, Ayanna's breathing slowed and her shaking stopped. "It wasn't the thunder," she said finally. Jake waited, not pushing her to explain. "It was the lightning. The way it lit up everything, bright as day for just a second. It reminded me of—" She stopped, pressing her lips together. "You don't have to tell me," Jake said. "The soldiers came at night." She continued anyway, like she needed to get the words out. "They used torches. Fire everywhere. My husband tried to fight them, but there were too many. They made me watch while they—" She stopped again, her hands clenching into fists. Jake felt something dark and familiar rise in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to become a killer in the first place. "After that, they kept me for 3 months," Ayanna said, her voice flat and emotionless. "Different soldiers, different camps. They had chains for the women who tried to run." She held up her wrists, and Jake saw the scars again in the dim light filtering through the barn door. "I got good at picking locks," she said with what might have been a bitter smile, "but not good enough to save the others." "How did you get away?" Jake asked. "I didn't. They sold me to a trader who sold me to another man who sold me to the auctioneer in town. Like I was a horse that kept changing owners." Jake was quiet for a long time, processing what she'd told him. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry that happened to you." "Sorry doesn't change anything." "No," Jake agreed. "It doesn't. Why did you buy me?" Ayanna asked suddenly. "The truth." Jake thought about lying, about giving her some practical reason that would make sense. Instead, he found himself telling her something he'd never said out loud before. "Because I recognized something in your eyes," he said. The same thing I see when I look in the mirror. Someone who's seen too much and lost too much, but who's still fighting anyway. Ayanna studied his face in the dim light. What did you lose? Everything, Jake said simply. My family, my farm. The man I used to be before I learned how to kill people. How long ago? 8 years. Outlaws came through, burned us out. Killed my parents, my sister, her kids. I was the only one who lived, and sometimes I think that was just an accident. So you became a gunfighter? I became a killer, Jake corrected. There's a difference. They sat in comfortable silence after that, two damaged people sharing a barn while the storm raged outside. When the thunder finally moved on and the rain softened to a gentle patter, Ayanna stood up and brushed the hay off her dress. Thank you, she said. For what? For not trying to fix me. For not pretending you understood when you don't? Jake nodded. I learned a long time ago that some things can't be fixed. They can only be lived with. As they walked back toward the house together, Jake found himself thinking that maybe for the first time in years, he wasn't the only broken thing on his ranch, and somehow that made him feel a little less alone. A week after the thunderstorm, Jake woke up feeling like he'd been hit by a freight train. His head was pounding, his throat was raw, and every muscle in his body ached. He tried to get out of bed to make coffee, but the room spun around him so violently that he had to sit back down. Great, he muttered to himself. Just what I needed. Jake had always prided himself on being tough. In his line of work, showing weakness could get you killed, but whatever sickness had gotten hold of him wasn't going to be fought off with willpower alone. He managed to stumble to the kitchen and was trying to figure out how to work the coffee pot when Ayanna appeared in the doorway. She took one look at him and frowned. You look terrible, she said bluntly. Thanks, Jake croaked. Just what every man wants to hear. Sit down before you fall down. Jake wanted to argue, but another wave of dizziness made him grab onto the counter for support. Ayanna moved quickly to his side, surprising him with how strong she was as she helped him to a chair. It's just a cold or something, Jake said, though they both could see he was burning up with fever. I'll be fine in a day or two. Ayanna pressed the back of her hand to his forehead and shook her head. You have the shaking sickness. I've seen it before. The what? White people call it influenza, I think. It can kill you if you don't treat it right. Jake tried to stand up again. I don't have time to be sick. There's work to do, animals to feed. The animals will live, Ayanna said firmly, pushing him back into the chair. You might not if you keep being stupid about this. Before Jake could protest further, she was moving around his kitchen like she owned it, gathering supplies. She put water on to boil and disappeared outside for several minutes. When she came back, her hands were full of plants Jake didn't recognize. What's all that? He asked. Medicine, she replied, starting to crush some of the leaves in a bowl. My grandmother taught me. These will help with the fever, these with the cough, and this one will help you sleep. I don't need to sleep. You need to stop talking and let me take care of this. There was something in her tone that reminded Jake he wasn't dealing with some helpless woman who needed protecting. Ayanna had survived things that would have broken most people. If she said he was sick enough to worry about, he probably was. The next few hours passed in a haze of fever dreams and strange tastes as Ayanna made him drink one awful-tasting tea after another. She stayed close, checking his temperature, making him sip water even when he didn't want it, and changing the cool cloth she kept putting on his forehead. As the fever climbed higher, Jake started to lose track of where he was and when he was. In his delirium, he was 8 years old again, hiding in the root cellar while his family's farmhouse burned above him. He could hear his sister screaming for help, could smell the smoke, could feel the heat of the flames. No, he mumbled, trying to get up. Have to help them. Have to save them. Jake. Ayanna's voice seemed to come from very far away. Jake, you're safe. It's just the fever talking. But Jake wasn't in his ranch house anymore. He was crawling out of that cellar, seeing his father's body sprawled in the yard, finding his mother and sister and the children in the ruins of what had been their home. He was 15 again, standing over fresh graves with dirt still under his fingernails and murder in his heart. Should have been faster, he said, his voice thick with fever and old grief. Should have been there. Should have protected them. Shh, Ayanna said, her cool hand on his forehead. It wasn't your fault. Was my fault, all of it. If I'd been a better shot, if I'd been braver, Jake, listen to me. Her voice was gentle but firm. You were a boy. There was nothing you could have done. Became a killer because of it, Jake whispered. Tracked down every man who was there that night. Shot them all. Felt good when I did it. What kind of person does that make me? A human one, Ayanna said simply. For 3 days, the fever raged through Jake's body while Ayanna stayed by his side. She made him drink her bitter teas, forced food down his throat when he could manage it, and listened to the broken pieces of his life that spilled out in his delirium. He told her about the boy he'd been before the killers came, how he'd loved books and music, how he'd dreamed of becoming a teacher like his mother. He talked about the first man he'd killed, how his hands had shaken for hours afterward. He described the emptiness that had grown inside him with each life he'd taken, until he felt like he was just a walking ghost. Never told anyone before, he mumbled during one of his clearer moments. Never had anyone to tell. I know, Ayanna said, wringing out another cool cloth. I understand. You must think I'm pathetic. Big tough gunfighter crying like a baby. I think you're a man who's been carrying too much pain for too long. When the fever finally broke on the 4th morning, Jake woke up feeling weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. Ayanna was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted at an angle that would probably give her a crick in her neck. Jake studied her face while she slept. Without the careful guard she usually kept up, she looked younger, softer, but he could still see the thin scar on her cheek. Still notice how even in sleep, her hands were positioned like she was ready to defend herself. You stayed, he said quietly when she opened her eyes. You were sick, she replied, as if that explained everything. Most people would have let me die and taken off with whatever they could. Carrie, I'm not most people. Jake tried to sit up and was surprised to find he could manage it without the room spinning. You probably saved my life. Maybe the sickness was bad. Why? Jake asked. Why take care of me? I bought you like you were property. You don't owe me anything. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window toward the mountains in the distance. Because, she said finally, you listened to my story without trying to tell me it could have been worse. You didn't try to fix me or save me or make me feel better. You just heard me. That's worth something. Jake felt something shift in his chest. Like a wall he'd built years ago was starting to crack. Besides, Ayanna continued with what might have been a small smile. Someone needs to make sure you eat vegetables. You're going to waste away if you keep living on coffee and jerky. Despite everything, the fever, the exhaustion, the raw feeling that came from having his deepest secrets laid bare, Jake found himself almost smiling back. I don't like vegetables, he said. I don't care, Ayanna replied. You're eating them anyway. As she stood up to make him some of her terrible-tasting but apparently life-saving tea, Jake realized something had changed between them. He'd shown her the broken parts of himself, the ugly truths he'd never spoken aloud, and she was still here. For a man who'd spent 8 years believing he was beyond redemption, that was nothing short of a miracle. Recovery came slowly for Jake, and with it came something he hadn't expected. Conversation. It started small. Ayanna would bring him meals, and instead of eating in silence, Jake would ask questions. Where had she learned about the healing plants? How had she known the fever was dangerous? Her answers were usually brief, but they were answers. After a week of being stuck in bed, Jake was finally strong enough to sit on the front porch in the evenings. That's where he found his mother's old Bible tucked under a stack of newspapers he'd never bothered to read. I didn't know you could read, Ayanna said when she saw him holding the worn book. My mother taught me, Jake replied. She was a school teacher before she married my father. Made sure all her children knew their letters. Ayanna was quiet for a moment, then said, I never learned. The mission school taught some of the children, but not the girls. They said we only needed to know cooking and sewing. Without really thinking about it, Jake found himself saying, I could teach you if you want. The offer surprised them both. Jake couldn't remember the last time he'd offered to do anything for anyone that didn't involve shooting somebody. Why would you do that? Ayanna asked. Jake shrugged. My mother always said reading was like having a conversation with people you'd never meet. Seemed to make her happy, and so it began. Every evening after dinner, they would sit on the porch with the Bible open between them. Jake would point to words, and Ayanna would repeat them, her finger tracing the letters as she learned to connect the shapes with the sounds. She was a quick learner, picking up new words faster than Jake had expected. But more than that, She seemed to understand that the lessons were about more than just reading. They were about trust. Him trusting her with something that had belonged to his mother, her trusting him enough to admit she didn't know something. "What does this word mean?" she asked one evening, pointing to a passage in Psalms. "Mercy," Jake said. "It means being kind to someone who doesn't deserve it, I guess." Ayanna considered this. "Is that what you think you did for me?" Showed mercy. "I don't know what I did," Jake admitted. "I just know I couldn't walk away." As the weeks passed, their conversations grew longer and deeper. Jake would read passages aloud, and Ayanna would ask questions that made him think about things he'd never really considered before. "This man, Job," she said one night. "He lost everything, but he didn't turn angry." "He didn't become a killer? How is that possible?" "Maybe he was stronger than me," Jake said. "Or maybe he had people around him who reminded him who he used to be." It was Ayanna who first started sharing stories of her own life. She told Jake about her childhood, growing up in a time when her people still moved freely across the land. She described the buffalo hunts, the ceremonies, the way her grandmother could predict the weather by watching the way birds flew. "My husband was a carver," she said one evening, her voice soft with memory. "He made the most beautiful things from wood. Horses that looked like they might run away. Birds so real you expected them to sing. His hands were always gentle." Jake found himself asking questions he'd never thought to ask another person. What had made her laugh as a child? What did she miss most about her old life? What did she dream about when she slept? "I dream about flying sometimes," she told him. "Like a hawk high above everything. I can see all the way to the mountains where my people used to hunt. Everything looks peaceful from up there. What do you see when you look down? A world without lines drawn on it. No places where one person owns the land and another person doesn't. Just earth and sky and everything living together." Jake tried to imagine what that would look like. For most of his life, the world had been divided into simple categories: us and them, good and bad, quick and dead. Ayanna's way of seeing things was foreign to him, but also strangely appealing. "What do you dream about?" she asked him one night. Jake was quiet for a long time. "I used to dream about my family," he said finally. "But they were always dying over and over again. Now I mostly dream about being somewhere else, somewhere nobody knows my name or what I've done." "Where would you go?" "I don't know. Maybe California. I hear they've got farms there where you can grow oranges year-round. Seems like it would be peaceful, growing things instead of killing them." "Why don't you go?" "Because running away doesn't change what you are. I'd still be me no matter where I went." Ayanna was quiet for a moment. "Maybe. Or maybe you'd discover you're someone different than you think you are." Their conversations often lasted late into the night, covering everything from the practical to the philosophical. Jake found himself looking forward to these talks more than he wanted to admit. For the first time in years, he had someone to share his thoughts with, someone who listened without judging. One night, Ayanna surprised him by asking, "Do you regret buying me?" Jake considered the question seriously. "No," he said, "but I regret that you had to be bought in the first place. Nobody should have to go through what you went through. If things had been different, if we'd met some other way, do you think we could have been friends?" Jake looked at her in the lamplight, this strong, intelligent woman who'd somehow ended up in his life by the worst possible circumstances. "Yeah," he said, "I think we could have been." "Good," Ayanna said with a small smile. "Because I think we're friends now, whether the circumstances were good or bad." It was such a simple statement, but it hit Jake like a revelation. He hadn't had a friend in 8 years. He'd forgotten what it felt like to care about someone else's well-being, to look forward to their company, to feel like someone actually understood him. "Ayanna," he said. "Yes? Thank you. For what?" "For reminding me that I used to be human." She reached over and briefly touched his hand, the first time she'd voluntarily made physical contact with him. "You still are human, Jake," she said. "You just forgot for a while." As they sat there on the porch listening to the night sounds of the desert and watching the stars wheel overhead, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the empty numbness he'd been calling peace, but the real thing. The feeling that, for this moment at least, he was exactly where he belonged. It scared him more than any gunfight ever had. The peaceful rhythm of their days was shattered on a Tuesday morning when Sheriff Wilson came riding hard up to Jake's ranch, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with worry. Jake was fixing a loose board on the chicken coop when he heard the hoofbeats. His hand automatically moved to his gun, old instincts kicking in even before he saw who was coming. Ayanna appeared in the doorway of the main house, her body tense and ready to run if necessary. "Jake," Wilson called out as he pulled his horse to a stop. "Thank God you're here. I need your help." Jake straightened up slowly, his eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. "What kind of help?" "The Dawson gang hit the bank in Copper Ridge this morning. Killed 2 people, including old Pete Harrison. They're holed up in the canyon about 10 miles south of town. And they've got hostages." Jake felt the familiar coldness settling over him, the same feeling he'd had before every gunfight for the past 8 years. "How many?" "6 of them, maybe 7. My deputies are good boys, but they're not gunfighters." "This isn't a job for regular lawmen. Why should I care?" Jake asked, though he already knew he was going to say yes. He always said yes when innocent people were in danger. It was the one thing about himself he couldn't quite kill, because they've got the minister's daughter and 2 little kids with them. If we don't stop them soon, they'll disappear into Indian territory, and we'll never see those people alive again. Jake glanced toward Ayanna, who was watching the exchange with unreadable eyes. He could see her taking in every detail. The sheriff's desperation, Jake's body language, the careful way both men were avoiding looking directly at her. "What's your plan?" Jake asked. "You know that canyon better than anyone. If you could get up on the rim and keep them pinned down, my boys and I could come in from the mouth and end this." It was a good plan, Jake had to admit. The kind of tactical thinking that came from years of dealing with desperate men in desperate situations. It might even work. "Give me an hour to get ready," Jake said. After Wilson left to gather his deputies, Jake went into the house to collect his guns. The twin revolvers felt heavy in his hands as he checked the cylinders and made sure they were loaded. He strapped on the gun belt he hadn't worn in weeks, feeling the familiar weight settle around his hips. When he turned around, Ayanna was standing in the doorway watching him. "You look different," she said quietly. Jake caught his reflection in the mirror on the wall and saw what she meant. The man who'd been teaching her to read, who'd shared stories on the porch and worried about whether she was eating enough, was gone. In his place stood Deadeye Morrison, cold and deadly and ready for violence. "This is who I really am," Jake said, his voice flat. "This is what I do." "No," Ayanna replied. "This is what you do. It's not who you are." Jake wanted to argue with her, but there wasn't time. He grabbed his rifle and a box of ammunition, then headed for the door. "Jake." He stopped and turned back. "Come back," she said simply. They were the first words in English she'd spoken to him on that first day, and hearing them again made something twist in his chest. "I always come back," he said, trying to sound casual. "Not from gunfights, from being him." She gestured toward the mirror where his reflection still showed the killer he'd become. "Come back to being you." Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and headed out to saddle his horse. The ride to the canyon and the gunfight that followed were a blur of familiar sensations. The weight of the rifle in his hands, the crack of gunshots echoing off canyon walls, the steady breathing and clear focus that came when death was on the line. Jake positioned himself on the canyon rim, just as he'd done 100 times before in similar situations. He could see the outlaws below, crouched behind rocks with their hostages huddled nearby. When he fired his first shot, everything else fell away except the deadly mathematics of angles and timing and staying alive. The fight was over in less than an hour. 4 of the outlaws were dead, 2 more wounded and captured. The hostages were safe, shaken but unharmed. Sheriff Wilson and his deputies were full of praise and gratitude. But as Jake rode home in the gathering dusk, all he could think about was the look in Ayanna's eyes when she'd seen him transform into a killer. He found her sitting on the front porch, as if she'd been waiting there since he left. She didn't ask if anyone had died. She didn't ask if he was hurt. She just looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "Did you come back?" she asked quietly. Jake dismounted and tied his horse to the post, his movements slow and tired. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him feeling empty and old. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know how to be both people at the same time. Maybe you don't have to be both people. Maybe you just have to choose which one you want to be." Jake sat down heavily on the porch steps, suddenly exhausted. "It's not that simple. There are always going to be situations like today. People who need help. Kids in danger." "I know," Ayanna said. "I'm not asking you to let innocent people die. I'm asking you to remember that saving people doesn't require you to become something you're not. What if it does? What if the only way to stop men like that is to be worse than they are? Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The soldiers who destroyed my village thought they were stopping bad people too. They thought my people were dangerous, that we needed to be controlled or eliminated. Does that make what they did right?" Jake looked at her sharply. "That's different, is it? Or is it just that you were on the side that won today?" The question hit Jake like a physical blow. He'd never thought about it that way before. The idea that maybe he wasn't the hero in these situations. Just another man with a gun deciding who lived and who died. "I saved those hostages," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, you did, and I'm glad you did. But you also killed 4 men who might have had families, might have had reasons for what they did. You didn't ask them to surrender. You didn't try to wound them instead of killing them. You just ended them." Jake felt something cracking inside his chest. They were killers. They murdered innocent people. And what does that make you? The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain that there was a difference between what he did and what they did. But sitting there in the growing darkness, looking at this woman who'd survived things worse than anything those outlaws could have done to their hostages, he couldn't find the words. "I don't know how to be anything else," he said finally. "This is all I've known for 8 years. Then maybe it's time to learn something new." Ayanna stood up and walked to the door of the house, then paused and looked back at him. "I stayed," she said. "Even knowing what you went to do today, even knowing you might come back covered in other people's blood, I stayed. Do you know why?" Jake shook his head. "Because the man who taught me to read, who listens to my stories, who worries about whether I'm eating enough, that man is worth staying for. That man is worth believing in." She went inside, leaving Jake alone on the porch with his thoughts and the weight of his guns and the echo of her words. For the first time in 8 years, Jake Morrison began to wonder if there might be another way to live. 3 weeks after the canyon shootout, Jake's past came calling. He was shoeing one of his horses in the barn when he heard riders approaching. Multiple horses, moving at an easy pace like they had all the time in the world. Jake set down his tools and listened, counting hoofbeats. 4 riders, maybe 5. That was too many for a social visit. Jake moved to the barn door and peered out carefully. 5 men sat on horseback in his yard, all armed, all watching his house with the patient attention of predators. He recognized the man in front immediately, even though it had been 3 years since he'd seen him. Bobby Crane looked older, meaner, with new scars on his face and a hardness around his eyes that spoke of too many years spent nursing a grudge. He'd been the younger brother of a man Jake had killed in Kansas, a fair fight witnessed by half the town, but Bobby had never seen it that way. "Morrison," Bobby called out. "I know you're in there. We need to have a talk." Jake glanced toward the house where he could see Ayanna's face at the kitchen window. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he saw her take in the situation with the quick intelligence he'd come to admire. She disappeared from the window, but he knew she was still watching, still thinking. "What do you want, Crane?" Jake called back, stepping out of the barn with his hands empty but ready. "Justice," Bobby replied with a cold smile. "For my brother Danny, remember him? You shot him down in the street in Dodge City like he was a dog. Your brother drew first. There were witnesses. My brother was drunk and stupid. You could have walked away." Jake could have pointed out that Danny Crane had been the one doing the challenging, that he'd been looking for a fight, and wouldn't take no for an answer. But he'd learned years ago that logic didn't matter much to men bent on revenge. "What do you want?" Jake asked again. "A fair fight. You and me, right here, right now. Winner walks away. And if I say no?" Bobby's smile widened, showing teeth that had been broken and badly repaired. "Well, that would be a shame. Especially for that pretty Apache woman you've got living with you." Every muscle in Jake's body went rigid. "She's got nothing to do with this." "Oh, but she does now. See, we've been watching you for a while, Morrison. Funny how a man changes when he's got something to lose. Makes him vulnerable." Jake felt the familiar coldness settling over him, but this time it was different. This time it was personal in a way that went beyond simple survival. "Here's what's going to happen," Bobby continued. "You're going to meet me in that yard there, and we're going to settle this the old-fashioned way. If you win, we ride out and never bother you again. If I win, well, let's just say your woman better hope I'm feeling merciful." Jake's hand drifted toward his gun, but Bobby shook his head. "Uh-huh. You try anything fancy. and my boys will burn this place to the ground with her inside it. The only way this ends clean is if you face me fair and square. Give me 5 minutes to get ready, Jake said. 5 minutes. Then we do this. Jake walked back into the barn, his mind racing. He could take Bobby in a fair fight. He was sure of that. Bobby had always been quick to anger but slow to think, and those weren't the qualities that made for a good gunfighter. But the other 4 men were wild cards. Even if Jake won, there was no guarantee they'd honor their boss's deal. He was checking his guns when he heard soft footsteps behind him. Ayanna had slipped into the barn through the back door, moving like a ghost. How many? She asked quietly. 5. Maybe more watching the roads. Can you beat their leader? Yeah, but I don't trust the others to play fair. Ayanna nodded, understanding immediately. What do you need me to do? Jake looked at her in surprise. I need you to get out of here. Take the back trail toward the mountains and don't stop until you reach the old mining camp. Hide there until this is over. No. Ayanna, these aren't the kind of men who... I said no. Her voice was firm, final. I'm not running away and leaving you to face this alone. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you chose to protect me instead of walking away. Jake stared at her, seeing the same stubborn determination that had kept her alive through everything she'd endured. You can't help me with this, he said. This is what I do. This is who I am, is it? Ayanna asked. Because the man I've been living with for the past 2 months doesn't seem like someone who would choose violence if there was another way. There is no other way. Not with men like Bobby Crane, maybe not. But you don't have to face this as Deadeye Morrison. You can face it as Jake, the man who reads to me in the evenings and worries about whether the chickens are getting enough to eat. Morrison, Bobby's voice carried across the yard. Time's up. Jake holstered his guns and started toward the barn door. But Ayanna caught his arm. Wait, she said. Before he could ask what she meant, she reached up and touched his face with both hands, looking into his eyes like she was memorizing them. Remember who you are, she said softly. Remember what you're fighting for. Then she kissed him. It was gentle, brief, and completely unexpected. When she pulled away, Jake felt like the world had shifted around him. Come back to me, she whispered. Jake walked out into the yard feeling like a different man than he'd been 5 minutes before. The cold professionalism was still there, the steady hands and clear focus. But underneath it was something else, something warm and worth protecting. Bobby Crane was waiting in the center of the yard, his hand hovering over his gun. About time. I was starting to think you'd turned yellow. Let's get this over with, Jake said. They faced each other across 20 feet of dusty ground, 2 men shaped by violence but driven by different purposes. Bobby was fighting for revenge, for the satisfaction of evening an old score. Jake was fighting for something he'd never had before, a future worth living. On 3, Bobby said. 1. Jake's mind was perfectly calm, his body relaxed and ready. 2. Time seemed to slow down the way it always did in these moments. Jake could hear his own heartbeat, could see the sweat beating on Bobby's forehead. 3. Both men drew at the same instant, but Jake's gun cleared leather just a fraction of a second faster. His shot took Bobby's center mass, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. The other 4 men tensed, hands moving toward their weapons, but Jake's gun was already trained on them. Your boss made a deal, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. I won. You ride out. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the oldest of the 4 men spat in the dirt and nodded. A deal's a deal, he said. Come on, boys. Nothing for us here. They collected Bobby's body and rode away without another word, leaving Jake standing alone in his yard with smoke still drifting from his gun barrel. It wasn't until they were completely gone that Jake felt his legs give out. He sank to his knees in the dirt, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't name. Relief, fear, exhaustion, and something else. Something that felt like gratitude. He'd won. He was alive. Ayanna was safe. But more than that, for the first time in 8 years, he'd fought for something other than his own survival. He'd fought for someone else, for a future that included more than just himself. Ayanna found him there a few minutes later, still kneeling in the dust. She didn't say anything, just knelt beside him and pulled him into her arms. It's over, she said softly. Yeah, Jake replied, holding on to her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become uncertain. It's over. But even as he said it, Jake knew it wasn't entirely true. The gunfight was over, Bobby Crane was dead, and the immediate threat was gone. But something else was just beginning. Something that scared him more than any gunfighter ever had. For the first time in 8 years, Jake Morrison had something to lose. And that changed everything. The morning after the gunfight, Jake woke up to find Ayanna already in the kitchen, making coffee like it was any other day. But everything felt different now. The air itself seemed changed, charged with possibilities that hadn't existed before. "How do you feel?" she asked when she saw him standing in the doorway. Jake considered the question seriously. How did he feel? For 8 years, the answer would have been simple: empty, angry, or nothing at all. But today was different. "Like I've been holding my breath for 8 years and finally remembered how to breathe," he said. Ayanna smiled, the first completely unguarded smile he'd ever seen from her. "Good. That's good." They had breakfast together on the porch, watching the sun climb over the mountains and listening to the sounds of the ranch waking up around them. The chickens were clucking in their coop, the horses were moving restlessly in the corral, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk was calling to its mate. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked. It was the question Jake had been avoiding thinking about all morning. What did happen now? For 8 years, his life had been defined by violence and solitude. He'd been a man with no past worth remembering and no future worth planning for. But now, "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never really thought about what comes after." After what? After being Deadeye Morrison. After being a killer. "I don't know how to be anything else." Ayanna set down her coffee cup and turned to face him fully. "You've been something else for months now. You just haven't noticed." "What do you mean? When was the last time you hired out your gun? When was the last time you went looking for trouble or picked a fight with someone?" Jake thought about it. "I guess. Not since the day I bought you." "And what have you been doing instead?" "Taking care of the ranch. Fixing things. Teaching you to read." "Living," Ayanna said simply. "You've been living instead of just surviving." The truth of that hit Jake like a revelation. She was right. Somewhere in the past few months, without him even realizing it, he'd stopped being a gunfighter who happened to own a ranch and started being a rancher who happened to know how to use a gun. "I want to ask you something," Jake said, "and I need you to tell me the truth. Always. That paper that says I own you, I want to burn it. But not because I'm freeing you, because I want you to choose to stay. Is that something you could do? Choose to be here not because you have to, but because you want to?" Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, and Jake felt his heart pounding while he waited for her answer. "I chose to stay a long time ago," she said finally. "The paper never mattered to me. I stayed because this place with you is the first place I felt safe since my village was destroyed. I stayed because you never tried to own me, even when the law said you could. And I stayed because what? Because I love who you are when you're not trying to be someone else." The words hung in the air between them, simple and powerful. Jake felt something inside his chest break open, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. "I love you too," he said, and was surprised by how easy the words were to say. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was too scared to admit it." "Scared of what?" "Scared that loving someone would make me weak. Scared that caring about you would get you killed. Scared that I don't deserve to be happy after all the things I've done." Ayanna reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "Loving someone doesn't make you weak. It makes you stronger, because you have something worth fighting for. And as for deserving happiness, everyone deserves a chance to start over." That afternoon, Jake built a fire in the yard and fed the papers that claimed ownership of Ayanna to the flames. They watched the documents curl and blacken and turn to ash, symbolically ending one chapter of their lives and beginning another. "What do we do now?" Jake asked as the last of the paper crumbled away. "Now we plant a garden," Ayanna said. "A garden? Something beautiful. Something that grows instead of dies. Something that proves we believe in tomorrow." So that's what they did. They spent the rest of the day clearing a patch of ground near the house, pulling weeds and rocks and preparing the soil for planting. Ayanna had saved seeds from various plants she'd found growing wild on the ranch, and Jake contributed some packets of vegetable seeds he'd bought in town months ago but never used. As they worked side by side in the dirt, Jake found himself thinking about the future in a way he never had before. Maybe they'd expand the ranch, get more cattle or horses. Maybe they'd travel to California and see those orange groves he'd dreamed about. Maybe they'd just stay right here and build something quiet and peaceful together. Jake, Ayanna said as they finished planting the last row of seeds. Yeah? What are you thinking about? Tomorrow, he said. And the day after that. And all the days that come after that. And what do you see? Jake looked around at the ranch, their ranch now, and then at the woman beside him, dirt under her fingernails and hope in her eyes. I see us, he said. I see mornings like this one, evenings on the porch, maybe some children playing in this garden someday. I see a life worth living. Good, Ayanna said, standing up and brushing the dirt off her hands, because that's what I see too. That evening they sat on the porch as they had so many times before, but everything was different now. Jake's guns hung on a peg inside the house, within reach if needed, but no longer a constant presence at his side. The Bible lay open between them, but tonight they weren't reading lessons, they were planning their wedding. Should we invite anyone? Ayanna asked. Sheriff Wilson might come if we asked him. He's a good man. What about your cattle baron friend, the one who owed you money? Jake laughed, the sound surprising them both. Hayes isn't exactly the wedding type. Besides, this should be just for us. The people who matter, who are. You and me, and maybe the preacher. If we can find one who doesn't mind marrying a reformed gunfighter to an Apache woman. And if we can't find one, then we'll marry ourselves. Out here under the stars with the mountains as witnesses. I think that would be more meaningful anyway. As the stars came out and the desert settled into its nighttime quiet, Jake and Ayanna made plans and shared dreams and talked about all the tomorrows stretching out ahead of them. For the first time in 8 years, Jake Morrison went to sleep that night not as a killer or a survivor, but as a man in love with a woman who loved him back. And in the morning, he would wake up not to another day of emptiness and violence, but to the first day of the rest of his life. In the garden they'd planted, tiny seeds were already beginning to stir in the dark soil, reaching toward the light, ready to grow into something beautiful, just like the two people who had planted them. Two wounded souls who had found healing in each other and hope in the promise of new beginnings. The feared gunslinger and the Apache widow had both died that day. In a way, in their place were Jake and Ayanna, partners in love and life, ready to build something lasting together in the wide open spaces of the American West. And if sometimes Jake's hand still moved instinctively toward where his gun used to hang, if sometimes Ayanna still startled at unexpected sounds, if sometimes the scars of their past lives showed through the happiness of their present one, well, that was only natural. Healing takes time, and some wounds leave marks that never completely fade. But scars, they had learned, could be beautiful too. They were proof of survival, evidence of strength, reminders of how far they had both come from the broken people they used to be. Together, they had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is choose love over fear, hope over despair, and tomorrow over yesterday. And in that choice they had found not just happiness but redemption.